We killed the list. Great. That's some encouragement. All right, so this is hooked up still? Oh, okay, so I should start. So everybody pretty much knows who I am, but I'm Dale Armstrong. I'm the Observers Group Chair for the London RASC. And so every month I stand up, I talk a little bit about what's up in the sky, but mostly what I do is it represents, as I've said before, a random walk through my mind over the last month, because whenever I see something interesting, I throw it into a PowerPoint. It almost didn't happen tonight, I gotta tell you, because I only realized the meeting was Friday, 2 days ago. And it was a real scramble to try and pull this together. So as usual, this is a pretty unrehearsed talk. But I start off with this slide here, and I'll come back to it a little bit later on. We had a little observing session down at Port Bruce last Friday, like it was the monthly observers group session at Fingal, but nobody wanted to go to Fingal, and Mohammed suggested going to Port Bruce. So a few of us followed him, and we had a little, I guess we found a little spot along the lake, and we had our own little star party. I was there until about 3:40 in the morning. This was a picture I took later on when the summer Milky Way was overhead at that time. You can see a few different things here. There was another amateur astronomer there, sitting in this lawn chair with a tracker or a tripod and a camera anyway, taking pictures all night long. He got there before we did and stayed till after I left. And we're looking due south, so you see Lake Erie and you see the summer Milky Way. And actually, I will come back to that. I just remember to have another slide in there, so we'll do that. So let me get started and we'll see if I can figure out how the remote control works. What do I have to do first?
Just left, right.
Just left, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So I push right, but nothing happens.
You might have to click on your.
It lights. Oh. What do I have to do? Oh, did we?
There, now try.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh, okay, that's perfect. Okay, so among the random things I came across was this. Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, they have a website for that, and I just stumbled across something called Curated Downloads. A curated collection of LROC team products created using LROC data, which was pretty cool. And they have this 3D printable models. And so what you can do is you can like download, for example, 3D printable models of all 6 Apollo sites at the same scale with a display card. So I thought that was neat. And they had a whole page of things like that. So I just share that with you in case you've never come across that. And then this guy is a guy who used to be a stocking Celestron dealer a long time ago. You probably never heard of him. I haven't really heard of him either. I know he does telescope review stuff, and I know when I bought an eyepiece years ago, I read his review and was encouraged by it and bought the eyepiece. And I just thought I'd show you this in the context of like telescope buying. Ed Ting is somebody I've mentioned before, and he talks about buying telescopes. But this article here is on his chuckhawks.com website. And I just show you the beginning of it, and then he really gets into it, and he talks about like 11 different issues that he considered when buying his telescope. As a fairly knowledgeable guy because he was a telescope dealer. And then his conclusion, he decided the best telescope for him was a 115 millimeter or 4.5 inch apochromatic refractor. So I just throw that at you if you're in the telescope market and you want to read an article that kind of considers a lot of the variables that you might consider if you were going to buy a telescope. Something else I think you're all probably familiar with, or at least I hope you're all familiar with, is this famous book here, which is now out of print by Deborah Jean Warner, called Alvin Clark and Sons, Artists in Optics. And of course, Alvin Clark and Sons were the ones who made many of the large diffractors in North America, including the Yerkes and the Lick Observatory. And it's a wonderful read, actually, because it's a whole history of the firm and it talks about the telescopes they made. I read it like back in the late 1980s. I don't have a copy, but again, I share that with you. But why I throw that at you is because in the context of the history of telescopes, I mean, I recently read Sheehan's biography of Barnard, and Barnard met John Brashear. And reading about that, I learned that Barnard had visited Brashear, but when I read that, I also learned that Brashear had written an autobiography. He was born in 1820. And died in 1840 and died in 1920. He had a good long life. I bought that book. I'm reading that. I'll come back to that and do a talk on that another time. And in the context of reading his book, I learned about another book that's worth maybe reading. Is this one called Holcomb, Fitz, and Pete. And it's the fascinating history of American astronomy through the lens of 3 pivotal figures, like 3 19th century American telescope makers. And this author here, meticulously chronicles the lives and contributions of these pioneering telescope makers. So that would be like kind of the next book I might want to read. And I don't know if you've heard of it, but maybe you'd want to read it too. And then you can get the Kindle version for a lot cheaper. And then every month I kind of throw at you, like some deals I saw on Astro buy sell, just because gear is fun. And, so I wanted to start with this one because Ryan Fraser had been selling a telescope. I don't know if he's sold it or not yet. He hasn't? Okay, so this is important that I show this. So what Ryan's doing for a couple of $1,000, he's selling a lot of stuff, an 80mm f6 refractor with a moonlight focuser. And it looks like,
Fine focuser.
sorry,
It's a fine focus.
a fine
So you
focus,
get 10-to-1 reduction.
a moonlight with a fine focus, so the 2-speed. And like he's got a flattener, here it is right here, there's the focuser right there. A beta click lock, a base plate, all this stuff. And then also Ryan threw in some pictures that he took, just to let everybody know that the telescope could do a nice job. And that's a nice picture of M31. And then another picture that he had in the ad. So if you're looking for a little imaging setup, that could be good. If $2,000 is too much, here's maybe the deal of the month in terms of imaging setups. This guy for $600 is selling like all this. Like he's selling a Zenithstar 61, and he's without going down the list. I mean, he's selling the guider for it. Like he's selling the field rotator for it. He's selling the focal reducer for it. Like basically you're getting the whole package for not much money. Like that's worth a lot more than he's selling it for. So that was an interesting one that stood out. Last month or no month before I talked about this eyepiece being such a good deal. If you weren't enamored with that eyepiece, the almost equivalent eyepiece did appear on Astro by itself for $600, the Nagler 3 to 6mm zoom in mint condition. But the thing we talked about last month or the month before was that the Svaboni, it turns out, is really excellent for the money, almost as good as this eyepiece.
And yeah, I'll add, I have 2 of those,
Which one?
what do they call it?
The Nagler or
The
the?
Nagler, thank you. So if
Yeah.
anyone wants to buy one of those Naglers, we'll do it for cheaper than that.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Oh, there we have the deal of the month.
Right here?
Right here. Yeah, because that's, because we go back. Yeah, it was $600 for the Nagler,
Almost nice.
which is not unreasonable, given what it is. And so here you can do a deal with Craig and get one for cheaper than that. I wish one of you would buy this. The guy's desperate to get rid of it. I've shown you this one before. He's reduced the price down to $970. He's still offering free shipping to a Canadian address. And you get a 5-inch refractor for less than $1,000. Still a great deal. And then we have the Explore Scientific 30mm 82-degree eyepiece, which is, he's selling it for $350. You will not find one of those for less than $350. That is a good price. The price on those fluctuates dramatically. The new price does, and so does the used price. But that's about as low as it gets if you're looking for a really nice 2-inch 82-degree eyepiece. It looks like this thing on the left, and weighs about 2 pounds. I like that eyepiece. It works really well on my 6-inch f5. It works well on a lot of telescopes, but I also like the $100 40mm Meade Series 5000 Colossal, because that also works well in some of the telescopes I have, and in our Celestron 14. One reason being that it's lighter than that thing. And then we have the this was, I don't know if this is a really good deal, but it's not bad. It's an Orion 10-inch for $650 for the tube assembly. If you're looking to make a 10-inch job, like if you take a look at the price of the new ones, you spend a lot more than that. If you're handy and you want a tube assembly that's never used, he says, then that would be kind of an interesting thing to pick up. And then we've got the and this is a sweet telescope. This is a William Optics Fluorostar 91, throwing in the flattener for $1,100. You can't beat that. That's a steal as well. I would highly recommend buying that telescope if you were in the market for something like that. And along those lines, I came across an Ed Ting quote I'll throw at you. He reviewed a Vixen EG80 Apo, and in that video he says, "My opinion of these budget apochromats hasn't changed in almost 20 years. I've been recommending them for a very long time. I think they're terrific bargains, and you get a taste of apochromatic magic without having to spend a small fortune." So I've highlighted a couple of things there that are good deals this month. Okay, so on to observing. I think, oh yeah, so this is like a real tangent. I wanted to discuss briefly, and this is with no rehearsal at all, so I can't promise to not make mistakes. Deep sky filters for astronomy, a brief history. I don't know how, not many people own deep sky filters for astronomy because it's kind of an esoteric item. You have to be really into observing, and you have to be really into looking for kind of esoteric objects, I would say, to get some of these things. But let me talk about these. I had just picked up that new 81mm Zenithstar, and I was thinking about filters and 2-inch focusers and all of that kind of thing. And I picked up, I think I told you last month, a really cheap Mead 2-inch diagonal for that thing, because I didn't like the existing diagonal. And then not long afterwards, Astronomy Plus had a Svaboni 2-inch O3 filter for 60 bucks, a used one. So I thought, yeah, you know what, that would be a nice addition to my stable of like filters. And I'd already picked up the RAC Deep Sky Challenge, I don't know, but a decade ago, I off Astro by selling, picked up a Lumicon UHC and a Lumicon 03, which was a nice pair, but those were one in the quarter inch. When I got the 6-inch f5, I wanted a 2-inch filter for the big eyepiece, like that 30mm that I just showed you. And I picked up an Astro by Cell, again, a DGM Optics NPB filter, narrow pass band. And so I had those, but when I saw that Svaboni, it was an 03 filter as opposed to a narrowband filter. So let's get into that a little bit. Lumicon was the ones that really started the whole thing. I mean, back in the 1970s, that stuff really didn't exist. And in the 1980s or so, there was a physicist at Lawrence Livermore Labs called Jack Marling. And Jack Marling became a member of the Tri-Valley Astronomers in California. And they had an actually interesting deal in their astronomy club. You had to pretty much work for Lawrence Livermore Labs to be a member. Like they limited their membership so that they always had to have 50% of the people there worked at Lawrence Livermore, and then they would let other people in as well. So it was kind of an esoteric group of very smart people, I would think. And what Marling did, I mean, he was so interested in this, he was also interested in thin film coatings. And I'm going to show you an advertisement from the autumn 1990 issue of Deep Sky magazine. You'll notice here there's even an article on do light pollution reduction filters really work. I'm not going to get into that. That's a topic for another time. But here's the ad. I mean, these were the ads that amateur astronomers saw at the time. Marling specialized in lots of what was at the time esoteric stuff for amateur astronomers, lots of astrophotography gear. But most importantly, and the thing that really was very popular was the ultimate in filter performance, like the Lumicon 03 and the Lumicon UHC. And so you could buy these filters in 1 1/4 inch or 2-inch. Even back then, I mean, they weren't cheap. Like we're talking $200 US for the 2-inch UHC and $200 US for the Oxygen 3. So they were always a bit out of reach for most people if you didn't have a lot of money for astronomy, including me. And I can remember early on, like about 40 years ago, looking through, and I don't know what brand it was, one of these filters, not being too impressed with the bizarre colors I was seeing. And I never really revisited that till much later in my observing career. That's actually a picture I dug up of Jack Marling. I don't think he's around anymore.
I didn't think that was you.
No, yeah, not yet. Anyway. He had this is Tri-Valley Astronomy Club observatory somewhere in California. I don't know where it is, but I just show that so you've got that. And then the Wayback Machine gives us these comments. This is from the Lumicon, the old Lumicon website, which is more. And it talks about how these filters, like there's a deep sky filter for viewing nebula from light polluted skies. The famous one is the UHC, the ultra high contrast filter, has a narrow pass band of 24 nanometers that isolates the two doubly ionized oxygen lines of 496 and 501 and the hydrogen beta line of 486 emitted by planetary and most emission nebula. And then Lumicon goes on to say provides superb views of Orion, Lagoon, Swan, and other extended nebula. The best all-around dark sky nebular filter available, which was true, like Lumicon was the gold standard. And then they had an Oxygen 3, a narrow pass band, only 11 nanometers, to isolate just the two doubly ionized oxygen lines at 496 and 501. And this is the filter you buy for planetary nebula and certain select faint nebula and supernova remnants, things like that. And they say it produces near photographic views of the Veil, the Ring, the Dumbbell, Orion Nebula, plus many other nebulas. O3s are really nice on the Veil Nebula, like in my 10-inch f6 with that Lumicon 03 that I just showed you, like it's just etched, like you can see all the detail in the Veil Nebula. And then the hydrogen beta, so it's an extremely narrow passband filter, and I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second, isolating that hydrogen beta line 486. That's a very unusual filter because it's really always touted as being the filter you would use to look at the Horsehead Nebula. But it's always a $200 filter, and so you never want to buy that just to look at one thing. I'll come back to that in a minute. But they suggest the Horsehead, the Cocoon, and the California Nebula. And And they say often it's the only way to view certain nebula, and it's best used under clear skies with large aperture. Like you need a lot of light because there's not much of a pass band. So what do I mean by that? So here's those lines that I was talking about. There's the 486 hydrogen beta line right there. And then we got the 496 and 501 doubly ionized oxygen lines right beside each other here. Okay, so let's take a look at filters. So TeleVue makes these kinds of filters. So I'll just highlight what they've got here. TeleVue's got this, what they call the NebuStar. That's their ultra high contrast filter equivalent. That's the red line. And so you can see in the whole visible spectrum, what these filters are doing is cutting out everything but the emissions that you're interested in. So this one here is fairly steep, comes up, encompasses the oxygen lines, encompasses the H beta line, and then drops right off. And then the other thing that you can get is the bandmate O3 filter. So that's this green line that comes up, goes around the O3 lines and drops right back down again. And then they've got this bandmate hydrogen beta filter, which is that blue line. And that one's centered just on the hydrogen beta line. So it comes up over hydrogen beta and comes back down again. So 3 different filters intended to do 3 different things. And now that's just one take on it. Like here's GGM is a company that was formed by another guy who is an expert in coating filters. And there's a guy called Dan McShane. And so the G is his middle initial. That's where the GGM comes from. He also makes a filter that's regarded as just excellent. But take a look at how this one works. Completely different than the one that TeleVue is selling, and also completely different than what the Lumicon ones look like. So what he's got is he's got one that encompasses the O3 and the H beta, but then look what he does down at the long end, around 610 nanometers. He runs it up into the red, and then it just kind of runs off into the infrared right there. And so why people like that one is because what it does is it adds a bit of red to the stars and makes them look a little bit more normal. And the people who do a lot of observing will say that what it also does, it also gives a bit of color to the nebula that you're looking at. So 2 different ways of approaching the problem, both work very well. Now, this is a guy you probably never heard of, unless you're like a cloudy nights aficionado, but way back a long time ago, about 2010, 2013 in that range, this guy here, who's a member of the Prairie Astronomy Club, got all these filters and tested them extensively and created these large lists of objects and which filter was the best filter to use to look at them. And this David Neasley put together like a whole page that still exists on their website. And so I'm highlighting his name because I'm blatantly stealing all his slides just to expound on what he talks about on that website. So let's take a quick look at this because maybe we can learn a little bit more about these filters. So he's got some filter myths like light pollution filters eliminate light pollution. False. Not quite. They can reduce the sky glow, but they do not get rid of all of it, especially under severe light pollution. So buying one of these filters does not solve the problem of living, say, in London, Ontario. Filters work best under light pollution. That's what people tend to think, but false. They actually work better under darker skies. That's the whole point of them, is to enhance these really faint things. And you don't want to be under some light dome when you're trying to do that. Filters make nebula brighter. Well, no, they don't. Filters can improve the contrast of nebula, but they aren't brighter. If you go back to those graphs I just showed you, you can appreciate why that is. Because what they're doing is, all they're doing is allowing the emissions from the nebula to come through and blocking out everything else. And that enhances the contrast, hence the name ultra high contrast that Lumicon used. And it makes these things stand out a little bit more. Filters are only useful in 8-inch and larger apertures. There tended to be a myth that you needed a big telescope. That may be more true of the H beta filter because they dim things too much in small telescopes. Well, that's actually kind of false too. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So he goes on to say filters don't dim the nebulosity and are useful in scopes from 50 millimeters on up, including the unaided eye. And back in Deep Sky magazine at the time, I highlighted that one article, and I didn't have time to look for it, but Alistair Ling of the RASC also did an article on these filters in Deep Sky magazine way back in the day. Alistair Ling was an early adopter of these filters, and Alistair Ling writes the observing column, co-writes the observing column in Astronomy magazine. And what Alistair's used like UHC filters for is putting them on the end of a cardboard tube, taping them on, and then looking through the tube at, say, the constellation Orion, to actually see Barnard's Loop with your naked eye without a telescope. So that's the kind of thing you can do with a 2-inch filter. You don't need an 8-inch telescope, you just need darkness. Okay, major filter types. Now I've alluded to what they are, but we can just take a look at this quickly. So there's broadband filters, and these are ones that try and notch out light pollution. Now that used to be more effective in the past, right? When the luminaires, like the street lights and stuff, had like a much broader output than a much narrower output than they do now. Now it's LED lights, and it tends to be the whole spectrum, and this is the bane of all of the astronomers. Then there's the narrow band filters, letting through, and I mentioned, right, the doubly ionized oxygen lines and the H beta line, and I showed you with that teleview graph how those were encompassed, and so this is just a reproduction of that idea. And they mentioned, I should mention the line filters. Let me do that. So these are the ones that only let through 1 or 2 spectral lines, and I mentioned H beta, and so you could also get just one that's an O3 filter as well. Okay, so those are your examples. Now, this is very old, so they talk about the best ones being the DGM NPB, the Lumicon ultra high contrast, and the Orion Ultra Block. If you are interested in buying an Orion Ultra Block, I warn you to be very careful. There was a Orion, they have a bad reputation for one reason, and that's because the filters often don't thread onto 2-inch focusers. I tried to buy one of these from a guy in Hamilton some years ago, and the Ultra Block seemed like a good deal, and I emailed and I said, like, so, like, does this thing actually thread on? And he said, well, it only threads on like about 1.5 threads, and then I passed on it. So Orion had a big problem with their threads. If you're ever going to buy one of those things, you want to watch that. Okay, let's keep going. Those are generally the 3 types of filters, and I should say, so the narrow band ones are the best, the ultra high contrast if you're just going to buy one filter. The broadband filters I would be inclined to ignore because they generally don't make enough of a difference to make it worth your money. And then the line filters like the O3 or the H beta, they are kind of the filter you would buy after you own a narrow band filter, because a narrow band filter is like probably the most widely applicable to all the objects that you might want to look at. Well, in his series of slides, he does mention broadband filters. He suggests they could be used for a mild improvement in contrast with some of the diffuse galaxies. I suppose if you had a lot of money and you wanted to spend the money to try that, you could, but you'd be better off spending the money on the gas to get somewhere really dark. And then also you've got the narrow band filters. Okay, so these are the ones like the DGM NPB, the Lumicon ultra high contrast, and the Orion Ultra Block if it'll screw into your eyepiece. And so these ones pass the O3 and the H beta. And like he says here, the best single filter of choice, provides more contrast on nebula than with broadband filters for sure. More effective on the greatest number of emission nebula, and shows the largest extent of nebulosity at a higher brightness level. So when you use one of these filters, the color will often change because you're altering what part of the spectrum you're looking at. And that's why the NPB throws some red in at the end of the spectrum. But what it does is it allows you to see like some of the stuff that just doesn't exist. Like a typical ultra high contrast filter will increase this contrast between the black and the white by fishing around on cloudy nights, people would say maybe like 3 magnitudes. So we'll come back to that idea in a minute too. So the O3 filter, I mentioned it's great for the Veil Nebula. You start to see all this detail when you use one of these things. It's a very narrow filter, remember, that just lets through the 2 O3 lines. And it's great for planetary nebulas. With an O3 filter. So we just talked about that because he's got that in here as well. One of the things you can do, if you've ever looked for a lot of the planetary nebulas in a typical star atlas, many of them are quite small, and when you're looking for them, you can't tell which star is the planetary nebula. And so this is where the O3 filter is super useful if you're into planetary nebulas, because when you put the O3 filter on, it dims everything, but not the planetary. Okay, so that's interesting. And then something else that they can be used to do is looking for something like Piece 1. The globular cluster M15 happens to have a planetary nebula buried inside it. It is not an easy thing to see. But what you can do if you have a telescope and an eyepiece with a large enough telescope and an eyepiece with a lot of eye relief, you can physically take the filter and like interpose it between your eye and the eyepiece and literally blink it by going back and forth. And you can watch a planetary nebula blink on and blink off as you dim everything in the field and then allow the planetary to brighten up again. So if you guys want to do something very challenging, you can do that with the Celestron 14. It is possible. H beta filter, okay, this is the one they always talk about being the Horsehead Nebula filter. They say the Horsehead Nebula is difficult or impossible to see without a filter, and that's probably true. Like in observing lore, they always used to say you needed a 12-inch telescope to see the Horsehead Nebula. It's not easy, and many people find it very challenging, and you need a dark sky to see it, like as he says, a tough visual object. And for this reason, HBA is one of the lesser used filters, because as I said, you have to spend a couple $100 to look at one thing. So what I will say to you is a couple of points. The first thing I would say to you is actually you can do without the H-beta filter. If you have an ultra high contrast filter or an NPV filter, remember it's taking in the H-beta line and the doubly ionized oxygen lines. And it's such a narrow bandwidth that I find that Horsehead pops out in a 10-inch, no problem, using not an H-beta filter. Then the second thing I'll say is what he did when he did his test, he did find it was useful on about 23 different diffuse emission nebulas, because he tested these things really extensively. So if you were really interested in the esoteric deep sky, there are a few more things than just the Horsehead Nebula. Okay, how do you make these things work? Like if you go and spend the money and buy one of these filters, what do you need to do? Well, a lot of dark adaptation. You need to get good and dark adapted, right? No white light, just red lights. And he says, use averted vision for sure. Filters are of the greatest benefit when enhancing the very faintest detail. And what I would add to that is using an observing hood. Like if you've got your dark adaptation, you want to maintain that, you want to even improve that. So you're probably using an observing hood over your head. And then the right magnification range. Like these things are not high power eyepiece filters. Like you want to have a wide field of view to sort of enhance your ability to see what's nebula and what's dark sky. And that's what these filters are all about. So, he's saying very low powers, no more than 10 power per inch of aperture. And then choose the correct filter for the given object and the conditions. Okay, so I've already talked about that a little bit. Moving right along, we get to the end of this. And so he says, if you can only afford one filter, get a DGM NPB, a Lumicon UHC. Thousand Oaks Optical made like an LP2, which was highly regarded, or the Orion Ultra Block, which, and this is part of his column, which is the least expensive at the time that he wrote that. And I think that was the problem with the filter threads as well. And then if you're going to get two, get an 03 for your second filter. Okay, so this has changed now, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I move along. And I'm just going to throw this at you because if you've been in amateur astronomy for a long time, you're familiar with Jack Marling and Lumicon and how great those filters were. Well, eventually Lumicon did kind of go out of business because, it's not a high demand item to buy these things. And if you start searching up Lumicon and Cloudy Nights, there's pages and pages and pages of speculation and discussion about what went wrong and what all happened. And there is still a Lumicon today, and it's a crazy story. And I can't get into the details now, but this Lumicon isn't quite the same as the original Lumicon. But what they do have on their page is a legacy page. And this goes on forever. And they give the whole detailed story because they were involved in a lawsuit about the copyright for this particular filter. And bottom line is Jack Marling started it, worked with a guy in Swiss, and they hired some firms to help with the thin coatings. Then that wasn't profitable. They stopped doing it. Then Marling was out of the picture. Swiss took over. He got SVO Tech to do the coatings, and then some outfit called Optical Structures to do the rings to put the glass in. And then they had problems. He sold it to this other person who then defaulted on the payments to the two companies they were using. And then both of them filed lawsuits to try and claim the brand because the original Lumicon brand seemed dead. And now you've got like two Lumicons, which you may or may not know. So I want to comment on that. So SVO Tech is actually a coating company, like they do the thin films. And so they are the first website I showed you. They call themselves Lumicon now. And if you read what they have to say about it, like they own the trademark. But Farpoint Optical, which is the old Optical Structures, which is owned by a guy called Kerry Chalabord, also sells filters, which are Lumicon. But remember, he just made the filter rings. So you have to be careful. Like I'd be hesitant to buy a filter made by a company that's specialized in making rings and not the actual coatings, because that's really tricky to do. Like Dan McShane, who I mentioned earlier, who's an expert on this, even he has trouble getting good filters from Omega, not because Omega can't do good filters, because it's just hard to do this stuff. And so what Teleboard is doing, what Farpoint does is they outsource all their stuff as far as I can tell from China. So a word to the wise there. so this is the Farpoint website, and you can see, yeah, they sell Lumicon, so like you have to be careful when you're gonna buy this. And in fact, one of the better ones now is Astronomique makes these ones here, like Bader also makes some nice ones. But I want to just show you this as I continue right along. So if you get yourself a 2-inch 03 filter from these guys, it's $273 Canadian now. So you have to really be into this. And then they give you all this technical data. They're talking about very high transmission, 95% transmission at the relevant wavelengths, which is really good. And Lumicon, what Lumicon used to do, if you have a really old Lumicon filter, actually what they did is they give you all the specifications handwritten on a sticker on the back of the filter. Like mine have that. Like they were actually tested before they were sold. Remember, because Lumicon was the gold standard. But in that whole history of who's buying what, actually, subsequent owners after Jack Marling, what they started doing is just writing the same numbers on every filter, apparently. So you have to be careful there too. Where this is wrong is they say the ideal filter for telescopes 10 inches and larger. Well, that's not really true. Okay, so let me keep going. So Teleview is in on the act too. And what they do is they take the German filters by Astronomie, and then what they do is they put them on a spectrograph, make sure the coating works, do cosmetic inspection for it, for everything else, and give it a 10-year warranty. And then so Teleview ones I've already talked about, they make all three. But the Teleview ones are even more expensive. You're looking at $364 for a 2-inch 03 Teleview filter. So that's kind of a lot of money. So you can understand why I was attracted to a $60 filter. And you might say, well, Dale, like you're wasting your money. It's a $60 filter. But if you go on Cloudy Nights and you start reading about this, actually, this Vivoni stuff is not bad. It's good bang for the buck. So I was curious to test that out. Now, you'll notice here that bandpass is 18 nanometers, so it's a little bit wide, right? Like if we think back to what I just showed you, the ultra high contrast filters are in the 10 to 12 nanometer range. And I think why they're going a little wider is basically because it's a cheap filter. Like it's hard for them to guarantee that bandpass is exactly where they want it, so they make it a little bit wider so that they can sell a filter that's pretty reliable. And so where we're going with this, and I'll just, here's the band passes I just wanted to show you. So Vivoni is at 18 nanometers, and actually they probably should be down around 10 or 12. That's the point I wanted to make by showing you that slide. So let's go back to last weekend when we had our little star party. So I had the little refractor out, and I had the 2-inch, it has a 2-inch focuser, and I had the 2-inch Vivoni, and I had the DGM NPV along. And so what we started doing, there was a couple of things I wanted to do with that. One of the things I wanted to look at with that filter was some of the nebula in the southern Milky Way, and I also wanted to look at the Veil Nebula, because that's really the target for this kind of thing. And I think what we decided, like Faraz was there and he was looking, and Mohammed was there and his friend Omar was there. We were kind of just doing a little A/B comparison on these filters. And so we went without a filter, we went with the DGM filter, and we went with this Vivoni filter. And the DGM filter definitely did improve the view. And when we went to the 03 filter from Vivoni, what it seemed to do is it did enhance the contrast. The 03, the nebular stuff was brighter. We were seeing a little bit more detail. And I was seeing when we looked at, like with the 81 millimeter, you can see both the Lagoon Nebula and the Trifid Nebula. And the upper part of the Trifid Nebula, you can see that with this Vivoni 03, but you couldn't see that with the DGM NPB. But certainly the nebula was all enhanced. So for the money, it seemed like a pretty good deal. And then for us, we were looking at the Veil Nebula in Cygnus. And the Veil Nebula in Cygnus stood out well, as did the North American Nebula with this Vivoni filter. So if you're looking, to sum it all up, for a cheap way to get into filters, that might be worth taking a look at this Vivoni filter, or at least reading what people have to say about it on Cloudy Nights. Okay, so what's going on in the sky? Hopefully you all watched this. I mentioned this before. It's been all over the news. Here was a picture done at Fingal back on June the 6th. So Jupiter there, Venus there. And if you were out early enough, you could get Mercury at the same time and see all three planets at once. A little bit later that night, Mercury's gone, but now everything's getting brighter, and you've got Jupiter, Venus, and of course the constellation of Gemini, the Twins, is behind the clouds, and you have the Twins, Pollux, and Castor are those two bright stars there. Now, it was cloudy in London when they were closest, and I was busy, so I didn't get out when they were closest, but I did get out on Friday night when we were down in Port Bruce. So now Venus is cruised up to here, Jupiter's down here, Pollux and Castor are there, and Mercury's still right there. So it's still possible to do that, I would say, if you get out there. So why am I showing that slide? I don't know. Let's keep going. Oh, yes, yes. When most people look at the Milky Way, it looks like you're looking at a planetarium, right? It's all flat. One of the things I was doing when I was showing these pictures in school this last week, I would say to people, like, where's the horse? Can you see the horse? I'd say, put your hand up if you can see the horse. And then it was really interesting. I invited people to come to the board, and on a whiteboard, you can take a dry erase marker and start drawing what you think the horse is. Well, actually, nobody can see the horse if you ask a bunch of elementary school students where the horse is. But of course, the horse is right there. There's the back legs, there's the two front legs, there's the horse's head right there. The back comes around, and there's kind of the belly of the horse there. And you can see that from a dark sky, maybe naked eye, but certainly with a pair of binoculars. But so what I say to people is like, let's contextualize this. Everybody shows this picture, but like if I show you this, it starts to get more interesting. So we got this guy in the chair, he's like 25 meters away. We got the south shore of Lake Erie about 92 kilometers away. All this yellowy stuff is just light pollution. Then we've got Messier 7, 980 light years away, Antares at 550, the Lagoon Nebula at 4,000, the M24 star cloud at 13,000 light years away. So there actually is a depth to this that you don't at first appreciate. And if we go to our Galaxy software, let me just show you this. So here's the sun. Here's the Sagittarius arm and the Scutum arm in the center of our galaxy. I'll just zoom in on that a little bit so you can read that maybe a little bit better. And then, of course, the spiral arms are where you find all the hydrogen and the dust and the stars. And then we zoom in on that a little bit more. Well, look, there's the M24 star cloud over here. It's over in the Scutum arm. And then you look and you say, well, where's that Lagoon Nebula? Oh, there's the Lagoon Nebula right there. Okay, it's in the Sagittarius arm. And you say, well, where's M7? Well, M7 is actually in our arm right there. So there's a huge depth to what you're seeing when you look at the summer Milky Way. Oh, I can zoom in a little bit more, so you see M24, M8, and M7 a little bit more clearly. But there's M24, M7, and M8. So vastly different distances because we're actually looking into different spiral arms of the galaxy. What's up in the sky right now? Not a lot, but this is going to be super fascinating because Mars and Uranus are only going to be 7 arc minutes apart on July the 4th. That's really close. So if you can find at dawn, if you can find the Pleiades, and you can all do that, then you can look and you can find Mars easily enough because that's a naked eye object. And if you point your telescope at that, Uranus will be right beside it. So that's one worth looking at. Now here's Pluto right here. August is always the time to try and see Pluto. Pluto finally moving out of Sagittarius towards Capricorn. And also we have a couple of asteroids that are visible in the summer sky. So let's just move on a second here and look at the Pluto. Oh, here's what Sky and Telescope had to say about Pluto. And this is true. In recent years, Pluto has exchanged the dense star fields of Sagittarius for the wide open spaces of Western Capricorn. They're visual observers. That's a good thing. A less crowded field makes the targets easier to find. When Peter and I did this back in 2015 with the Celestron 14, it was a pretty crowded star field. And there was a lot of faint stars, and you really had to pay attention. So a less crowded star field makes things a lot better. And here's the diagram for Pluto, and it's in your handbook if you don't have the Sky and Telescope chart, which I did not reproduce. So you should think about giving that a try if you've never seen Pluto. Mercury is visible right now. Pluto, I've mentioned this before, it's not getting any brighter. Like it's not going to be more than a few years, and it's going to be really hard to see because it's getting fainter right now. So this asteroid right here, Flora, is just down by the teaspoon in Sagittarius at magnitude 9. It reaches opposition on the 27th. So that's like trucking right through the summer Milky Way. That's worth the try. And the other one that hits opposition in July is Juno. And Juno hits opposition on the 9th, and it's also magnitude 9. And it's also well placed. So that's another one you might want to consider looking at. And even a pair of binoculars would probably show you that. Okay, so Club Observing Weekend will probably be the new moon weekend. So we're hoping for a clear night on July the 17th or 18th. And if there's enough interest, we might go to Fingal, or maybe we might go somewhere else as we did this last week. So thank you very much.
That's the mean. July 17th.